Hey everyone, welcome back to Global Unknown Facts. Today, we're diving into an interesting topic, a story lost in time, buried under centuries of silence. Long before Spanish ships cut across the blue waters of the Pacific, long before the name Philippines ever existed, these islands were already alive with civilization. They were not empty lands waiting to be discovered, nor were they scattered tribes lost in time. They were home to complex societies, rich cultures, global trade networks, and deeply rooted systems of belief. Yet this chapter of history is rarely told. Overshadowed by colonial narratives, the story of the Philippines before Spain remains one of the most forgotten civilizations in Asia. To understand this forgotten world, we must first erase the idea that civilization only begins with written records or foreign rule. The Philippine archipelago had been inhabited for tens of thousands of years. Archaeological discoveries show that early humans reached these islands as far back as 50,000 years ago. One of the most significant finds is the Calao Man, whose remains suggest that ancient humans were already adapting to island life long before many other parts of Southeast Asia were settled. These early inhabitants were skilled survivors, mastering fishing, hunting, and tool-making in a challenging environment shaped by seas, forests, and volcanoes. Over time, these early communities evolved. By around 4000 BCE, waves of Austronesian-speaking peoples began arriving from Taiwan. They did not come as conquerors, but as navigators, masters of the sea. Using advanced boat-building techniques and an intimate understanding of wind and stars, they spread across the islands, laying the foundations of what would become Filipino culture. Their descendants would later travel even farther, reaching Indonesia, Madagascar, and the far corners of the Pacific. This alone places the early Filipinos among the greatest maritime peoples in human history. These Austronesian settlers introduced agriculture, pottery, weaving, and animal domestication. Rice cultivation began to flourish, especially in the northern regions like Luzon, where the famous rice terraces, often attributed to a later period, were part of a much older tradition of environmental engineering. These terraces were not merely farms, they were symbols of cooperation, mathematical planning, and spiritual harmony with nature. Every stone placed, every water channel carved, reflected generations of accumulated knowledge passed down orally. Contrary to the idea of primitive tribes, pre-colonial Philippine society was highly organized. Communities were typically centered around the barangay, a political and social unit led by a datu. The datu was not an absolute ruler, but a leader whose authority depended on wisdom, bravery, and the ability to protect and provide for the people. Loyalty was personal rather than territorial, and leadership could be challenged if a datu failed his responsibilities. This system encouraged accountability and mutual respect between leaders and followers. Social classes existed, but they were fluid. At the top were the nobles, often relatives of the datu. Below them were the free men, known as timawa, who enjoyed rights, owned property, and could rise in status through bravery or service. At the bottom were dependents often mislabeled as slaves by Spanish chroniclers. In reality, this group, called alipin, lived under various conditions. Some worked to pay off debts, others served households temporarily. Many could regain freedom, and their status was not inherited permanently. This was vastly different from the brutal chattel slavery practiced in Europe and the Americas. Women in pre-colonial Philippine society held remarkable power compared to many other parts of the world at the time. They could inherit property, initiate divorce, lead rituals, and even rule communities. Some of the most respected figures were babaylan, spiritual leaders, healers, and keepers of knowledge. These women, and sometimes men who took on female roles, served as bridges between the physical and spiritual worlds. They preserved history through chants, guided communities through ceremonies, and held influence equal to or greater than the datus in many regions. Religion before Spain was deeply animistic. The world was believed to be alive with spirits of ancestors, forests, rivers, mountains, and the sea. These spirits were not distant gods, but active participants in daily life. Rituals were performed to ensure good harvests, safe voyages, and protection from illness. Ancestor worship was central, reinforcing respect for lineage and memory. Death was not an end, but a transition into another form of existence, where ancestors continued to guide the living. Despite the lack of a written alphabet in the Western sense, early Filipinos were not illiterate. They used writing systems such as babaylan, a graceful syllabic script written on bamboo, leaves, and bark. Poetry, laws, genealogies, and contracts were preserved through oral tradition and writing combined. Spanish colonizers later dismissed these systems as inferior, leading to their decline, but their existence proves that intellectual life thrived long before colonization. Trade played a massive role in shaping pre-colonial Philippine society. Far from isolated, the islands were deeply connected to Asia and beyond. Chinese merchants traded silk, porcelain, and beads for gold, wax, and forest products. Indian influence arrived through trade routes, bringing Hindu-Buddhist ideas that blended with local beliefs. Arabic traders introduced Islam, particularly in the southern islands, centuries before Spain arrived. By the 14th century, powerful Islamic sultanates had already formed in Mindanao and Sulu, with diplomatic ties to neighboring kingdoms. Gold was abundant in the islands, and early Filipinos were expert goldsmiths. Archaeological finds reveal intricate jewelry, masks, and ornaments crafted with astonishing skill. Gold was not merely wealth, it was status, art, and spirituality combined. Spanish chroniclers themselves were shocked by how much gold adorned the bodies of natives when they first arrived. Yet much of this treasure was later melted down or stolen, erasing tangible evidence of this golden age. Warfare existed, but it was governed by rules and honor. Raiding was common, often driven by competition, revenge, or the need for resources. Warriors earned prestige through bravery, and victory songs and tattoos marked their achievements. Tattoos were not decorative alone. They were records of life, courage, and identity. A fully tattooed warrior was a living chronicle of battles survived and victories earned. Language diversity flourished across the archipelago. Hundreds of languages and dialects developed, reflecting the island's geography and history. This linguistic richness was not a weakness, but a strength, allowing communities to preserve unique identities while still engaging in trade and alliances. Multilingualism was common, especially among traders and coastal peoples. Perhaps the greatest tragedy of Philippine history is not colonization itself, but the erasure of memory that followed. When Spain arrived in the 16th century, they did not just conquer land, they rewrote history. Pre-colonial societies were labeled as savage to justify conversion and control. Indigenous beliefs were demonized. Babaylan were persecuted. Written records were burned. Oral traditions were dismissed as myths. In less than a century, a civilization thousands of years old was pushed into the shadows. Yet traces remain in language, in customs, in festivals, in food, and in values. The Bayanihan spirit, respect for elders, communal cooperation, and resilience did not come from Spain. They came from the ancient Filipinos. The Philippines before Spain was not a blank page. It was a living, breathing civilization with its own achievements, failures, and wisdom. To remember this past is not to reject the present, but to reclaim identity. History does not begin with colonizers. It begins with the people who lived, loved, struggled, and dreamed, long before foreign flags were raised on their shores. The forgotten civilization of the Philippines deserves to be remembered, not as a footnote, but as a foundation. Thanks for watching. For more interesting topics, please subscribe and share this channel.